All right, welcome back. This is the video lecture focusing on the Jackson presidency. Um, Honestly, this is probably one of my least favorite things to lecture about, but we're going to get through it. All right. The subtitle for this lecture is The Bad, the Good, and the Ugly. And that's the order we'll take them in. The bad is going to be Andrew Jackson and the bank war. The good will be Andrew Jackson and the nullification crisis. And the ugly will be Andrew Jackson and Native Americans. It will become pretty apparent why this is one of my least favorite things to lecture on. Let's pop over to the old share button. Andrew Jackson, elected 1828, beating, this is Jackson here, beating his opponent, John Quincy Adams. Jackson will serve 2 terms as president, being reelected in 1832. It's difficult, like Jackson is a very, like when Jackson does things, it's hard to tell if he's doing them from any sort of like fixed political ideology or if he's doing things just to get revenge on people he doesn't like. In the best of both worlds, in the best of Jackson world, he gets to do both at the same time. But it can make understanding him somewhat difficult. Let's start with the bad, and that is the bank war. Now, this is about the National Bank of the United States, or the BUS, as it was sometimes called, Bank of the United States. What are the functions of the Bank of the United States? Just to review, this bank is very similar to the Bank Hamilton. It started way back in Unit 2, the Washington lecture. So it takes in government deposits. Okay, the government needs some place to put its money. It also, in addition to that, printed money that was accepted throughout the US. Now, the government itself did not print money at this time, okay, the way that the government does today, right? We have the Federal Reserve. There are 12 printers throughout the United States. The Bank of the United States, which was located in Philadelphia, they printed money that was accepted throughout the United States. It could also extend credit, whoops, to state banks who could then extend credit to citizens in that state. So if you wanted to add on to your factory and you needed a loan, you would go to a state bank and their credit would have gotten from the National Bank of the US. Now, why does Jackson hate the National Bank? Well, the bank had gotten into the habit of making loans to congressmen. And Jackson saw that as a threat to government. And I would agree. We really don't want our members of Congress, the House and the Senate, being beholden to a bunch of bankers. That might influence legislation, it might influence how someone votes. So in 1832, Jackson vetoed the Bank of the United States renewal. The bank was not a perpetual institution. It had to be rechartered, and Jackson decided not to. Now, in his message, he mentioned that the bank was a threat to democracy, which I could sort of see that. Again, the loans to congressmen. That it existed to keep the common man down, which not really sure where that's coming from. And on a personal level, because again, sometimes Jackson is striking from political ideology, and sometimes it's a personal beef. The bank was controlled, now he did not say this part out loud, by the New England people who had stolen, his words, the election of 1824 from him. Okay. Remember, Jackson had claimed that because he won the popular vote, he was the winner, and had gone on and on and on about how the election had been stolen from him and from the will of the people. If this sounds kind of familiar to you, it should. So he's able to mix some of his political ideology, some revenge against people, and whatever this is. Now, what did Jackson bring about to replace the National Bank of the United States? Well, state banks. Took in federal deposits. So basically, these state banks took over where the National Bank of the United States. The only requirement is that the state bank, the board who ran the bank, had to be Democrats. And that was pretty much the only requirement. So what we've done here is we have replaced one mildly corrupt bank, okay, allegedly corrupt, with the possibility of, hundreds and thousands of corrupt banks. Okay. We could have fixed this one mildly corrupt bank with a simple piece of legislation, but instead, we're just going to open up the possibility of creating hundreds, if not thousands, of corrupt banks who all take in deposits and who all print money. By the time of the Lincoln administration, so Jackson did this in 1832 when he destroyed the National Bank. By 1860, there are 7,000 different monies in circulation in the US. So instead of having one paper money system that the Bank of the United States provided, we have 7,000 different monies in circulation in the US. So it caused massive problems for Lincoln, the Civil War. You've also got some of that money is counterfeit, to be honest, and some of it, banks that issued it had gone out of business years before in some cases. So it just created this massive problem that the government would have to fix in the middle of trying to fight a civil war. There are some defenders of Jackson's bank destruction that by going to this system, it made it easier to get money out into the West, which again has always been a problem, if you know from other lectures. But I realize I'm looking backwards. Obviously, Jackson does not know in the 1830s what his actions are going to lead to. So I'll give him some credit, but in retrospect, yeah, it was a bad idea. Here's a drawing showing the order to shut down the National Bank. Here are the bankers running away who are in league with Satan, as you can see here. So it was championed at the time by a lot of Democrat establishment. The Republican establishment was not particularly happy with this whole thing. In fact, Jackson was censured by the Senate. He's the only president in history to be censured. And censure basically means they just read a letter into the official record about what a jackass you are or what you've done that is so filled with jackassery. Jackson has, and I'm quoting, Jackson has assumed upon himself an authority and power not conferred by the Constitution or by the laws of this nation. And it will actually lead to a new political party in response, new opposition party, because the party has pretty much died. So now there will be a new opposition party called the Whigs. Because if Jackson is going to behave like a tyrant, then he will be reacted to like a tyrant. And the Whigs, you remember all the way back into our discussion of the Declaration of Independence, the Whigs had been opposed to tyrants. So that's the meaning of why they get that name. There will be one Whig president, but he'll die not in office. So, and then the Whig party will eventually die off, and it will be replaced by a new Republican Party, which is today's Republican Party. All right, so that's the bad. Let's get to the good. And that would be, whoops, looks like we've already got some writing here. Let's see what this says. Sorry about that. Okay, so the nullification crisis, let me back up. Nullification crisis. What is nullification? Why don't we start there? We already have the definition here, which I had already written out some other time. Nullification is the belief that a state can refuse to enforce federal law for two reasons, either to protect its citizens' civil liberties or to protect its own interests. Now, I say the belief because it has never been accepted by any legitimate court in the United States. Okay? It wasn't accepted here in the 1830s. It wasn't accepted in the 1860s. It wasn't accepted in the 1950s. It wasn't accepted during the Obama administration, which is another time it made a comeback. Okay, so it is a belief. It is a theory. It is not accepted. What caused this whole thing? Well, in 1828, the U.S. raised the tariff. Now, if you pay attention to the news, there's been a lot of talk about tariffs. So let's review. Tariffs are an import tax. Okay? If something is imported into the United States, there is a tax on it. That is called an import tax. When countries raise the tariff, we typically get what is called a retaliatory tariff. Other countries raise their tariff in response. So, modern day example, when the Trump administration raised the tariff against China or against Europe, the response was to raise the tariff against American products. This is what happened back then. Britain raised the tariff, their tariff, on cotton, okay, which is going to cut into Southern cotton profits. So the South was very, very upset about this. And one state, one representative in particular, the Vice President, John Calhoun, South Carolina, began to champion nullification. And he wrote a whole book about it. It had one of those long titles, the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Now, he is the vice president, so he's doing all this anonymously. Okay? But he wrote a book explaining nullification, explaining how nullification worked. And then as part of it, he sort of said that states should be able to secede if they cannot nullify federal law. When this theory was introduced in the Senate, Daniel Webster argued against it, insisting that the people created the Constitution, not the states. And I think I have a quote here. Somewhere down here, do I have this quote? Sorry. Well, I thought there was a quote up here. Okay, well, he said it's not a quote you need to know, but he said it is the people's constitution, the people's government made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. Again, that sounds very similar to what Lincoln said at Gettysburg, government for the people, by the people, and so on. If you look at the Constitution, the first three words of the Constitution are "we the people," not "we the states." Jackson himself said, "I consider the power to annul a law assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, forbidden by the Constitution, and destructive of our great Union. The Constitution forms a government. To say that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union is to say that the United States is not a nation." Andrew Jackson had spent his whole life fighting to keep the United States safe. He had fought the British when he was a teenager. He had fought Native Americans. He had fought the Spanish. He had fought to keep the United States safe and whole. He's not going to let his own countrymen tear it apart. In 1832, South Carolina threatened to secede. Jackson, quote, "Do not be deceived by names. Disunion by armed force is treason." And Jackson ordered the army to begin planning, or I guess to plan, for the invasion of South Carolina. And nobody doubts that he would have done it. And there is no doubt in anyone's mind, in anything I have ever read, that if push had come to shove, that Jackson would have done it, that he would have invaded South Carolina. He would have sent the army to stop secession. South Carolina backed off wisely. And so the nullification crisis was considered solved. And in fact, in 1833, tariffs were actually lowered. Now, there is, and not everyone accepts this, what I'm about to talk about, a belief that the tariff was not the real issue here, that the tariff was a decoy, a red herring, a smokescreen, that what Southerners actually feared is any type of federal law that might try to regulate or even outlaw slavery, and that they tried to use the tariff issue to get nullification powers to prevent any attacks on slavery. Based on some quotes, which I wish I had right here with me, that's kind of the belief among some historians. There are others who do not believe that, who've looked at the same evidence and have not come to that conclusion. But I, looking at it, and other people whose work I admire, having read their work on it, agree that, yeah, this was an attempt to get nullification powers to keep slavery safe from any type of federal law. All right, we've done the bad, we've done the good, and now it is time to do the ugly, and that is going to be Jackson's policy with regards to Native Americans. Before Jackson, the government, the federal government, had kind of a two-track policy regarding Native Americans. One was removal, okay? Just move them further away from white people. Okay? And then the other was reform, where Native Americans would be taught to adapt to white society. And those are the two tracks that US government policy have run on since about Jefferson. And these policies have been decided by the president. This was not a congressional issue or an issue for the courts. This was a presidential issue. What Jackson is going to do differently is, one, make removal the only policy. And second, make this Congress's issue to deal with, not the president's. Now, it should come as no surprise that Jackson wants Native Americans out of the way. He had been fighting Native Americans, God, since 1819, if not before, and wanted them moved further and further away because they're in the way. Now, we can't just come out and say, hey, we want your land. We need something else, right? And so this is where Lewis Cass comes in. Now, Lewis Cass, we're going to see him again. Most of us, as we go through life, only come up with one idea that kills a lot of people. Lewis Cass will come up with two ideas that will kill a lot of people. So we'll see him later on the way towards the Civil War. But he will be the quote unquote expert for why Native Americans must be removed. One, language problems. Now, that doesn't mean Native Americans can't learn to speak English. Obviously, they can. Okay? There are Americans who have learned to speak their language. Sam Houston learned to speak Cherokee's language, and there are Native Americans who have learned to speak English. That's not the problem. The problem is abstract concepts. We, and when I say we, I mean you watching the video, me, we can all agree on what a dog is, right? We were to sit down and come up with a definition for the word dog, we would pretty much all come to an agreement on the word dog. If we came up with a definition for the word tree, we would all pretty much come up with the same definition for tree. But if we were to sit down and try to come up with a definition for the word democracy, we might start finding some differences. Do we mean direct democracy, participatory democracy, representative democracy? What kind of democracy are we talking about here? We would start coming up with differences. And if we as Americans cannot agree on a definition for the word democracy, what chance do Native Americans have? Capitalism would be another word, right? So Native Americans will never really be able to understand these concepts, and so they'll never fit in. That's why they can't adapt. He is wrong about this. Okay? He is horribly wrong about this. Okay? Second, he says the natives cannot adapt to white society because they don't want to. Right? That they live in a perpetual hunter state. So the idea of settling down on a farm and raising crops and going to school and going to church, they just don't want to do that. Again, wrong. Okay. The Cherokee had done this. There was a Cherokee nation, there was a Cherokee constitution, there was a Cherokee schools, there was a newspaper printed in the Cherokee language. Hell, there were Cherokee who owned slaves. Okay? So I think the natives can adapt themselves to white society pretty easily. Okay? Whether they may enjoy being out on their horses hunting all day, but since they can't, they can adapt. But this is still going to be, again, our expert. Okay, what causes this crisis? The Cherokee, and let me pull up a map to show you where the Cherokee lives. So there's the northern corner of Georgia, a little bit of Alabama, and just the tiniest bit of what the hell is that? Tennessee and maybe one of the Carolinas. All right. The Cherokee had adopted their own constitution, their own nation. Whoops. There was a Cherokee president. There was a Cherokee Congress. There was a Cherokee court. Right? So the Cherokee pretty much adapted to white society pretty well. In 1828, the state of Georgia passed a law forbidding this. Told the Cherokee to knock it off. Or leave. You know, the Cherokee, if you really want to have your own constitution, your own nation, and all that stuff, you have to go somewhere else and do that. Okay? You can't do that in the state of Georgia. The other problem is that gold had been found on Cherokee land. So illegal prospecting was being done, and this had led to sort of a low-level war between the Cherokee and the white folk. Okay. Oh, I'm just misspelling words all over the place today. There we go. So yeah, two strikes against the Cherokee on that one. They're attempting to live under their own laws, and gold has been found. So you know how this is probably going to go. In 1830, Congress passed what was called the Indian Removal Act. Remember, Jackson wants to get Congress involved in this. And the Indian Removal Act said that natives cannot live under their own laws. Okay? So this whole Cherokee Nation, Cherokee Constitution, that ain't gonna fly. All right. If they want to move where they can have their own laws, the US government will help move them. Move them across Mississippi. Okay? To what is essentially today Oklahoma, a little bit of Arkansas, and so forth. Now, some natives took the deal. They already knew exactly how this was going to end. Where's the paperwork? Let me sign it and just get on my way and move. Jackson is doing this because he believes that if the natives stay, and it's not just the Cherokee, it's Creek, the Seminole, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and a few of these other tribes up here. He honestly believes that if they stay, they will eventually be wiped out by white America. Jackson understands how deeply prejudicial Southerners are against Native Americans because of what had happened in the War of 1812, because of Tecumseh's rebellion. And so he honestly believed that this was the best thing for the natives, was to get them away from white America while they were still alive. And again, some of the natives simply took the deal and moved. Um, you can see Indian removal here from 1830 to 1838, affecting these tribes, but also the Seminole, the Shawnee, Miami, Potawatomi, and some of these tribes still up here in the Great Lakes. There were still some tribes up in New York, the Iroquois Confederation, you might remember from Unit 2, but they had already cut deals, and a lot of them had simply moved up into Canada. But those who remained sort of in upper New York State had already come to their own agreements um, with the governments in the area. Um, these trips were pretty horrific. The whole thing was kind of farmed out to the lowest government bidder. Um, there are a couple of lawsuits that the Cherokee did file. Let me talk about those real quick. Um, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, one of them. This made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee. It said that the Cherokee, and in fact, all Native Americans, were domestic nations subject only to federal law, not state law. Okay? So it actually ruled in favor of what the Cherokee had been doing. The second one was Worcester v. Georgia, in which, again, the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's Indian laws, native laws, were unconstitutional. And Jackson simply ignored the Supreme Court, much in the way he ignored Congress, much in the way he ignored the National Bank. He's just ignoring Congress. He has responded, allegedly said, John Marshall, who was the head of the Supreme Court, has made his ruling. Now let's see him enforce it. And so Jackson simply ignored the ruling from the Supreme Court. Um, Something that may be coming up soon in our own country again is whether or not the authority of the Supreme Court will overrule what the president wants. But yeah, pretty brave thing to do. It had no effect on Indian removal. And again, Indian removal continued. Indians, natives died on these removals. Often there was not enough food or enough transportation or enough blankets, to keep warm. The worst of these roundups was the last one, the Trail of Tears in 1838, which you can see the route. They decided to move in the late fall winter, and for some reason they decided to take them this way, where it would be, cold and snowy, Illinois, Kentucky, and out of about 16,000 Cherokee who began, about a quarter of them died on the Trail of Tears from exposure, hypothermia, not enough food, et cetera, et cetera. So now you know why I don't like teaching this particular lecture, but it has to be done. That is the end of the Jackson presidency. I will say Jackson was no longer in office in 1838, but he still receives blame. He was the one who pushed for this. He was the one who ignored the Supreme Court. So those deaths are as much on his hands as they are on anyone else's. That is the end of the Jackson lecture, The Bad, the Good, and the Ugly. And I will see you for the next lecture, which will be about abolition and some social changes that affect the United States during the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even up into the 50s as we sort of begin making our way closer to the crisis of civil war. And I will see you later and have a good day.